Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can hear me. Thank you for joining us for another Beale Company webinar, the next in the series of our regular construction law updates. Many of you are regular listeners and will be aware of the format for these now. Thank you for joining us again. I'd like to welcome the new attendees and hope this webinar is informative and useful for all. In this webinar, as this title slide indicates, we will consider the second edition of the CIC BIM Protocol, which was published on the 10th of April 2018 and was drafted by our very own Andrew Croft. The use of BIM is now commonplace in the UK after the government's BIM mandate requiring BIM on all centrally procured public sector projects from April 2016. However, contractual documents have not kept up with the pace of this progress. We at Beale Company have seen this when asked to advise on contract documentation. Frankly, there has been a mixed approach to reflecting BIM, from vague references just to BIM in the procurement documentation and little else, to, say, incomplete CIC BIM protocols. The recently published NBS report on construction contracts has echoed our experience. It identifies that the majority in the industry viewed BIM as contractually binding, but only 30% saw reference to specific outputs from BIM in their contracts. This is clearly not good. This has demonstrated, in our view, the need for additional clarity as to how BIM is reflected contractually in order to avoid the real risk of uncertainty and the true benefits of BIM not being achieved. So just some quick introductions. My name is Will Buckby, and I lead the projects and contracts team at Beale Company. Today, I'm joined by Andrew Croft, an excellent associate in the projects and contracts advisory team. Andrew, not me, will be presenting this webinar. Andrew is the firm's BIM guru, and over the last 5 years, Andrew has been heavily involved in the legal developments of BIM in the UK, but also internationally, as well as playing a lead role in the first edition of the CIC BIM Protocol. Andrew was the lead consultant appointed to draft the second edition, so he knows the CIC BIM Protocol pretty well. In recent years, Andrew's BIM work has spread to mainland Europe, the Middle East, and also Japan. We're delighted to be working with the CIC and the UK industry generally in relation to BIM. And of course, congratulations, Andrew, for his excellent work. This is perhaps a bit of a bold statement, but I'm not aware of anyone in the UK legal profession with Andrew's experience in relation to BIM, and hopefully Andrew can pass this on to you today. So as most of you will know, the CIC BIM Protocol is a key document in helping the construction industry adapt to the increasing digitally driven changes we are seeing across the industry. As I mentioned, the second edition of the CIC BIM Protocol was published on the 10th of April 2018. Today, Andrew is going to explore the changes which have been made in the second edition. The second edition has been received very positively following its publication, with real acknowledgement that meets the industry's demands. We hope that it will be increasingly incorporated into contractual documents going forward, that it provides some much needed additional clarity as to the contractual obligations in respect of BIM. So I'm now going to hand you over to Andrew, who will explore the updated CIC BIM Protocol in more depth.
Thank you very much, Will. In this webinar, I will first set the scene by very briefly considering the original CIC BIM protocol and exploring the background to the amendments which have been made in the second edition. I will then consider the amendments which have been made and their key impact, including in respect of the relationship between the protocol and the underlying agreement, a new collaborative mechanism which has been included in the updated protocol, amendments which have been made to reflect current BIM standards, obligations in respect of the programme for exchanging information, provisions in relation to interoperability, and copyright. I will also take a look at steps that need to be taken to incorporate the CIC protocol into a contract, and have a look in particular at the approach under a JCT contract and under the NEC4 suite. Finally, I will consider the industry responses to the updated BIM protocol and give my view as to how it impacts the contractual landscape. As usual, questions can be raised during this webinar using the interactive box on your screen. It's likely that, given time available, I will leave the majority of questions to after webinar and revert to each of you together or collectively, depending on the nature of the questions. So, the original CIC BIM protocol was published in 2013, and the CIC BIM protocol remains the UK's only standard contractual protocol for use on projects using building information models. The original CIC protocol was part of the suite of BIM Level 2 documents, which were issued to support the UK government's BIM strategy, which, as Will mentioned, included the mandate to use BIM on centrally procured government construction projects by 2016. The key aims of the original protocol included, obviously, to make BIM a contractual requirement. In doing so, to make minimal amendments necessary to existing contracts, but also importantly to create consistency across the project team, given the collaboration involved on any BIM project. The original protocol was generally well received and was used and is being used, for example, by Cambridge University and NHS trusts. Nevertheless, the CIC considered it necessary to update the protocol for various reasons, including those set out on these slides. Firstly, the use of BIM has become, since the protocol was published, standard practice. And PAS 1192.2 is very commonly adopted. In addition, the approach to BIM has developed since the original protocol was published, with new standards released, including, for example, PAS 1192.5 in relation to information security. Unfortunately, despite this progress, contracts have not kept pace, as identified, for example, in the King's College Construction Laws Department's report enabling BIM through procurement and contracts, and the more recent Winfield Rock report. In addition to these general concerns, feedback has suggested that the protocol would benefit from further flexibility, for example, in relation to intellectual property, and that the appendices could be made more easy to complete. The CIC therefore thought it was necessary to update the protocol, and that it was a good idea to update the protocol to increase uptake and make it a more flexible document so that it reflected industry practice. This is generally to promote uptake and encourage clarity in relation to the contractual position regarding BIM. In producing the updated BIM protocol, the CIC consulted across the industry with various sectors of the construction industry, including those working on BIM projects, those advising on and negotiating construction contracts, industry bodies and contract publishing bodies such as the NEC and the JCT, for example, the BSI, the drafters of the PAS suite of standard BIM documents. The CIC also took into account other feedback on the original protocol, including the King's College report, as I mentioned, and the Winfield Rock report. So, what are the changes in the updated CIC protocol? Firstly, the updated protocol applies to all information, not just models, and this reflects the approach under PAS 11922. It's not just about adding additional obligations in relation to models, it's about information exchange and collaboration as a whole. In addition, the terminology used in the protocol is now more consistent with PAS 11922. This is to encourage use of the protocol and make that use easier. The protocol is also now a more flexible document. A term I've used a number of times is that the updated protocol piggybacks on the underlying agreement a lot more than the original protocol, including, for example, in relation to intellectual property. This means that the number of changes required to the underlying agreement to incorporate the protocol should be limited. In addition, the appendices to the protocol, which, as with the original protocol, are key for the protocol to have its intended effect, are now easier to complete. They are editable, and there is more detailed guidance included in the protocol. This should make incorporating and completing the protocol more straightforward. And it reflects the comment that Will made earlier, that we would often see the CIC protocol being incorporated into contracts, but appendices not being completed, for example. In addition, the new updated protocol includes optional security provisions to reflect PAS 11925 and the increasing concern in relation to information security generally. So, how does the protocol relate to the underlying agreement? The updated protocol now states that it only takes precedence over the underlying agreement if there is a conflict in respect of the key obligations and provisions regarding BIM, i.e. Clause 3 and 4 and Appendix 1 and 2. This is a more flexible approach than the original protocol, which essentially said that the protocol would take precedence over the underlying agreement as a whole. This achieves the intention of creating a minimum set of consistent contractual obligations across the project team in relation to BIM, without overriding the agreed underlying contractual position any more than necessary. Nevertheless, a key point to note is that this means that for the protocol as a whole to have effect, the order of precedence stated in the agreement is key. And for absolute clarity, unless the parties have agreed otherwise, the agreement should expressly state that the protocol takes precedence in the event of a conflict. Another key area in relation to the new updated protocol is the approach to coordination and collaboration regarding information. Collaboration is a key part of what BIM is, and collaboration is essential on any BIM project. The updated protocol includes a new process in Clause 2.2 for the coordination of information and resolving inconsistencies. Essentially, rather than saying that in the event of any conflict, a model will take precedence over any other information, as the original protocol essentially stated, the updated protocol now provides that if anybody becomes aware of ambiguity or conflict between information, they'll get together and try and agree a way of resolving that inconsistency. This is trying to create a collaborative process so that any inconsistencies can be nipped in the bud at an earlier stage, rather than being noticed at a later point when they may have a more significant implication. Following on that point, the protocol now also talks about coordination meetings being attended, as stated in the information particulars, to further encourage the increased coordination of information. As I've mentioned previously, the underlying standards are key on any BIM project. These include, for example, PAS 1192-2, the specification for information management for projects using building information modelling. These standards set out key processes which should be followed on a BIM project in order to obtain the real benefits of BIM and to clarify the basis on which information is being produced and exchanged. These standards make various assumptions in relation to tasks which will be carried out by the procurer of a project and by the project team. Under the updated protocol, both parties have obligations in relation to the standards stated in the information particulars. The employer's obligation in clause 3.1 and the project team's obligation in clause 4.1. This helps embed the agreed standards in the contract and try and join up the approach that the project team is taking in terms of applying those standards on a day-to-day basis and what the contractual obligations are. Another key aspect of any BIM project is the use of a common data environment process. This is essentially used to share and publish information. Under the updated protocol, unless this is part of the project team member's obligations, the employer is to arrange that the project team member can make use of the CDE process to the extent necessary to perform its obligations and to enable it to download a record copy of the information at the end of the project or on termination. The project team member is also to share and publish information during the course of the project using that common data environment process under clause 3.13d. This again helps create a more joined up approach between what the contract says in relation to the project team member's obligations and the approach on the ground. This also helps to create more certainty in relation to the common data environment, and the fairly recent case of Trant and Mott MacDonald from 2017 highlighted the importance of doing so when essentially the project extranet was not accessible or the consultant sought to withhold access to the project extranet because it hadn't been paid by its client, and the dispute essentially escalated because the contractual obligations in relation to that project extranet or common data environment were not clearly set out, so it couldn't be easily resolved. Another key amendment in the updated protocol relates to the permitted purpose. The role of the permitted purpose under the updated protocol is the same as it was under the original protocol. Essentially, the permitted purpose determines how information can be used. The definition has, however, been expanded to reflect key aspects that are taken into consideration when information is exchanged on any BIM project in the common data environment. In addition, the level of definition is comprised of the level of information and the level of model detail, which is an aspect of determining what the permitted purpose of information is. This is consistent with the terminology used in PAS 1192-2. It does underline the importance of considering what levels of definition are applicable on any project at the outset, and identifying that in the information particulars in Appendix 2 if you're using the CIC protocol. Another key factor that's taken into account when determining the purpose for which information can be used is the status code of information, which under BS 1192/2007 indicates the approved suitability for use of information at the stage it is issued. So, the contractual provisions regarding the purpose tie in with the processes that are being applied on a daily basis on the project. Another key area that indicates the permitted purpose is the functional state of project information. Essentially, whether it is work in progress, whether it has been shared, published, or archived, which again are processes of the CDE process under BS 1192/2007 and are key in determining how information is intended to be used when it is issued, if at all. The final point that's taken into account, as with the original protocol, is the purpose for which information was prepared. So, the rights that are granted to use information are now tied in with the processes that are being applied on a daily basis. As well as the right to use information, the permitted purpose also determines the liability of the project team members for use of that information. And clause 7.2 of the updated protocol excludes liability for use other than for the permitted purpose. So, to summarize, the updated protocol now links the purpose for which information can be used and liability for use of that information to the processes that are being applied on a daily basis. The approach to program and timeliness of exchanging information has also changed under the updated CIC protocol. The specified information which the project team member is to provide must now be shared or published during the stages or at the time stated in the responsibility matrix, the information particulars, or the agreement, subject to any extension of time which are essentially applicable under the agreement. This is a more certain obligation than the original protocol, under which the obligation to provide the information was subject to reasonable endeavours and events outside the project team members' control. This therefore helps create greater certainty as the timescale for development and exchange of information, and that applies both in terms of the information that a project team member knows that it is required to provide and what time, but also what time it can expect other project team members to share information so that it can coordinate its own information. Nevertheless, I mentioned previously that completion of the appendices remains key to the use of the updated CIC protocol, and to ensure that there are some clear obligations on the project team member in relation to the timescale of exchanging information, it is important that those timescales are set out in the responsibility matrix, which is Appendix 1, in the information particulars, Appendix 2, or in the underlying agreement. which just underlines that with the updated protocol, as with the original protocol, simply attaching a blank version of the CIC protocol won't achieve the intention of clarifying the contractual obligations in relation to BIM and is likely to create uncertainty. Another key area in relation to BIM, which is addressed in the updated protocol, is the approach to interoperability of information. Interoperability essentially concerns the ability of different software formats to exchange and make use of information. The first edition of the protocol, to address concerns that had essentially emerged regarding interoperability, stated that the project team member didn't warrant the integrity of electronic information that it was shared, essentially, because the project team member couldn't guarantee that the information it shared would look the same when it was accessed by another member of the project team, for example. There's been a lot of progress across the industry in trying to mitigate the risk of interoperability, including steps that are taken by, for example, the Open BIM initiative, so that you do not require software-specific information anymore. Nevertheless, this remains an important issue to consider on any BIM project, and because of that, the updated CIC protocol still addresses this point, but simply says that the project team member gives no warranty that software being used is compatible with that of any other project team member, save to the extent that the project team members expressly under an obligation to ensure that that software is consistent. This should provide greater assurance that information provided can be relied upon or can be used with less concern than under the original protocol. As with the original protocol, under the second edition of the BIM protocol, liability of the project team member for data corruption is still excluded, which essentially reflects the fact that the project team member shouldn't be responsible for events that happen to information that it's shared after it's transferred that information to a third party, unless that's because it's failed to comply with its obligations under the protocol or the agreement. It is therefore important that any process for exchanging and accessing information tries to manage the risk of data corruption generally, whether that's because of interoperability or otherwise. Another key change in the updated protocol is in relation to the approach to copyright. The CIC protocol now includes more flexible provisions regarding copyright ownership. Essentially, clauses 6.2 to 6.4 state that the project team member retains copyright ownership and grants a license to the employer, but this position only applies if the agreement contains no provisions regarding intellectual property, essentially a fallback position to provide some certainty if the underlying agreement is completely silent. In the majority of circumstances, I would expect that the position in clause 6.1 would apply, which now provides that the provisions in the underlying agreement in relation to intellectual property will essentially be expanded to also apply to information provided under the CIC protocol. This means that the CIC protocol can now be used unamended, even if the project team member will no longer retain ownership of its intellectual property, for example because it's been transferred to the employer, as is required on a number of public sector projects. If ownership of intellectual property is being transferred to the employer in relation to any BIM information, it is important that the project team members consider if there is any key background intellectual property which they are not prepared to transfer to the employer, in particular because they would want to use it on any other projects going forward. And a typical example could be any standard information model objects that the project team member has developed over a series of time. So that's just something to consider generally in relation to intellectual property. Another key area which has changed under the updated CIC protocol is the inclusion of additional provisions in relation to security. Security and information security is a key factor which should be taken into account on any project when BIM is used, as outlined in PAS 1192.5. Essentially, because of the greater exchange of information through the common data environment process, there will be an increased use or increased risk that if a member of the project team is subject to a cybersecurity attack, that will have a significant impact on the project as a whole and on the employer or the rest of the project team. To address this concern, the protocol now includes additional security provisions, including an additional role of Built Asset Security Manager, which is a role which is referred to in PAS 1192.5, to ensure that somebody in the project team is considering this issue on an ongoing basis. As with the role of Project Information Manager, that doesn't have to be a separate member of the project team. In most circumstances, I think it's envisaged that it would be an existing member of the project team that carries out that role. The updated CIC protocol also includes additional obligations in relation to the security requirements to ensure that processes and policies can be put in place in relation to security and that they are effective on the project. The CIC protocol also now includes provisions in relation to particularly sensitive information, which, for example, the employer doesn't want to be shared across the whole project team, for example. The protocol therefore envisages that information won't be shared in the CD process and enables the Built Asset Security Manager to issue instructions as to how that sensitive information should be handled. The employer also has additional remedies in relation to the security obligations if they are breached, which reflect the significant risks of security on any BIM project. Now, the security obligations are optional under the updated protocol, and they can be easily turned on or off simply by stating in Appendix 3 that they are not going to be used, or by not essentially completing or attaching Appendix 3 to the protocol. The updated CIC protocol also includes additional provisions which are linking the Capex and Opex phase of a project. One of the key incentives for the UK government encouraging the adoption of BIM was to try and make the use of information following the project by the operator easier and more seamless, essentially. And that was reflected in PAS 1192.3. The updated CIC protocol therefore includes a hook to try and link the project team members' obligations under the protocol to the approach that's going to be taken by the employer or the operator following the completion of the project. Essentially, by providing that the project team member will provide such assistance as stated in the information particulars in connection with the asset information model that the employer may be preparing. This reflects other initiatives such as the government soft landings process, which are intending to make this handover process more seamless, and yet, as I mentioned, enable the capital phase of a project to be linked with the operational phase. It is evidently important that to create that link, you clearly set out what assistance is going to be provided in Appendix 2 to the protocol. Under the updated protocol, Appendix 1 is now called the responsibility matrix rather than the model production and delivery table. One of the reasons for this change, and one of the key reasons for the change, is because the responsibility matrix is an existing document that is provided for in PAS 11922, and therefore you don't need to prepare a separate document, or you shouldn't need to prepare a separate document and attach it to Appendix 1. It should really be a case of including a document which has already been prepared in accordance with the PAS 11922 processes. Or if that's not the case, the document that's attached to the protocol you should be able to use to embed that PAS 11922 process going forward. The key points that should be included in any responsibility matrix are the specified information which the project team member is going to be producing, sharing and publishing during the course of the project. The responsibility matrix should also indicate the applicable level of definition, i.e., as I mentioned before, the level of information and or level of model detail. It should also identify the information to be produced by other project team members, if possible, so that all members of the project team are aware of what information other members of the project team are going to be sharing and when, to encourage coordination and collaboration and reduce duplication. As I mentioned before, under the updated protocol, completion of the appendices is really key for the protocol to have its intended effect. And where possible, Appendix 1 should be completed before the protocol is incorporated into a contract. Appendix 2 to the protocol has also had a name change. It is now called the Information Particulars. Essentially, Appendix 2 is intended to set out key information or key documents that are required for BIM projects under PAS 11922, for example, and generally for the protocol to have effect. These include, for example, the employee's information requirements, any BIM execution plan, which are two key documents under PAS 11922. Under the protocol, any reference to the information particulars also include those two key documents. So there is a hook for requiring the project team member to comply with those documents. Although Appendix 2 to the protocol also includes a process for resolving inconsistencies between the employee's information requirements and the BIM execution plan, essentially by using the process included in Clause 2 of the protocol, which I mentioned earlier. There is other information which is important is identified in Appendix 2 for the protocol to have effect, as I mentioned just now. This includes, for example, the timetable for project coordination meetings, any process that might have been agreed for resolving inconsistency between information, the applicable standards, the assistance that's going to be provided regarding the asset information model, the agreed approach to using different software formats or interoperability, for example, and any additional specified information which isn't included in the responsibility matrix, for example. The appendices in the CIC protocol, as with the original protocol, are not intended to be fixed documents. The appendices are going to be reviewed at each defined project stage, as provided under clause 3.1.3a. So it doesn't mean that if you attach a document at Appendix 1, you're tying yourself to that document indefinitely. So they are the key changes under the updated version of the CIC protocol. I'll now briefly look into steps that should be taken if you want to use the protocol. Essentially, by using the protocol, I mean incorporate it into a contract. Essentially, for the protocol to have contractual effect, it obviously does need to be incorporated into the contract. Simply referring to the protocol in an invitation to tender or in the employee's information requirements or BIM execution plan alone is unlikely to be effective and most likely would create uncertainty. Unfortunately, all of those things are examples that we've got practical experience of seeing. So it's just really important that if it's intended the CIC protocol will be used on a project, that it is expressly incorporated into the contract. And the updated CIC protocol, as with the original CIC protocol, includes an incorporation clause which can be adapted as necessary to make sure that the CIC protocol is a contractual document. In addition to using that clause, appendices 1, 2, and if the security obligations apply, 3, then need to be completed and appended. That will most likely need to be a joined up piece of work between the lawyers drafting the contract and the project team who are preparing, for example, the scopes of services and carrying out the project so that those appendices can be correctly completed. So, looking at a couple of specific examples, how would you use the CIC protocol with the JCT suite? For example, the JCT Design and Build Contract 2016 refers to a BIM protocol. However, the JCT suite also provides that nothing will override or modify the agreement or the contract conditions, which is clause 1.3 of the DB. That is obviously a potential inconsistency between the JCT DB and the CIC protocol. So, although the updated CIC protocol only takes precedence in relation to key BIM obligations, there is still a potential mismatch or inconsistency. So, to use the CIC protocol alongside the JCT contract, it's important to consider either amending the JCT form so that that statement is no longer included, or to expressly allow the protocol to take precedence where necessary, or deleting the relevant parts of clause 1.4 of the protocol. Guidance on this, on using the CIC protocol with the JCT suite, is included in the guidance note to the CIC protocol. Another example that I'll consider is using this updated CIC protocol alongside the NEC4 suite. Now, the NEC4 suite were published last year in June and contain a new BIM secondary option, X10. The NEC4 published guidance on using the updated protocol with NEC4 contracts on the same day as the protocol, and there's a link on the slide to that guidance. The NEC4's suggested approach is essentially to include a model scope entry which refers to the protocol and, amongst other things, aligns the terminology which the NEC4 options in relation to BIM use with the terminology used in the CIC protocol. And essentially that's because the NEC4 uses its own essentially new terminology in the BIM option, which does need to be aligned with the more standard terminology used in the CIC protocol. One point to note is that if the NEC4 approach to incorporating the CIC protocol is followed, you need to be careful regarding the project manager instructing changes to the scope, which is generally something that's anticipated in NEC contracts. Essentially, if an instruction was issued to change the scope, that might include a change to the CIC protocol, which is incorporated into the scope, and therefore that change to the scope could quite fundamentally change the project team members' obligations in relation to BIM. It's therefore worth considering clarifying that the project team members is not able to instruct changes to the CIC protocol unilaterally. In addition, if the NEC4 approach is used and the protocol is used under the NEC4 contract, it's important to consider the protocol alongside the other documents which the NEC4 suite provides to be prepared, and ensure that there is no conflict between the protocol and those documents. So, the protocol has only been published for a month and a half or so now, but as Will mentioned, initial reception of the updated protocol has generally been very positive, and it's hoped that the updated protocol will help the construction industry move towards a more collaborative digital future, as Dale Sinclair suggests. In addition, it's been widely acknowledged that the updated protocol has clearly taken on board feedback from the first edition and creates a more flexible and user-friendly approach. So, just to conclude, the Wimful Rock report published earlier this year identified a number of inconsistencies and concerns in relation to the contractual approach to BIM, and that echoes our concerns and experiences in relation to how BIM is being reflected in contracts. A joined-up approach is rarely taken. This means that there is a risk of uncertainty and inconsistency in relation to the contractual position regarding BIM. The new protocol is more closely aligned with BIM standards, it's more flexible and easier to use. We therefore really hope that the updated CIC protocol leads to increased uptake and helps clarify the contractual approach to BIM going forward. I've included some useful links on this slide to a few articles outlining the changes in the CIC protocol in further detail, and I'll leave this slide up in case you're interested in accessing those links. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. I hope that you found it useful. We will be hosting further webinars going forward at Beale Company, so watch this space. One particular webinar which is likely to be held depending on when the documents are published would be consideration of the updated RIBA professional services agreements, which are due to be published in the next month or so. Do also feel free to let us know or let me know if there are any particular issues which you would like us to cover in a webinar. It remains for me to say thank you very much for listening to me and Will this afternoon. If you have any queries in relation to any of the items discussed this afternoon, do not hesitate to contact us on the details shown or through the boxes on your system. Once again, thank you very much for listening.